The Winnipeg Jets are looking for a spark, and they might get it against the Boston Bruins, with Brad Lambert getting demoted and Nikita Chibrikov being called up. Will it make a difference for the team? What do we make of all of this? Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, the Jets are taking on the Bruins later this evening. Should be an interesting game. I want to chat about the lines for the Bruins and also some potential changes for the Jets with some things perhaps up in the air, maybe somebody coming in, maybe somebody going out. And obviously this is being recorded well before practice lines, so these are all subject to change, but we'll get into that in just a little bit. Before we dive into all of that, though, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. If you are looking for a big return to start the season, new customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, Winnipeg is coming up against a Bruins team that so far has been maybe a little underwhelming for some. Boston is third in the Atlantic, and if you look at their record overall, they're a solid team, but I think in a lot of ways, the goaltending perhaps hasn't quite been where they were expecting it to be. And generally speaking, the Bruins feel like a team that's probably on life support. They're rocking a negative goal differential. And while they have gone on a 4-game win streak recently, if you look at the quality of opponents that they're beating, the Bruins probably aren't super thrilled with how they've played overall. Boston's beaten, the Wings, Habs, the Hawks, and the Flyers recently, but none of those teams are really in a playoff spot. So who have the Bruins actually beaten recently that are legitimately good? I would say that their highest quality win, you would probably have to go back some weeks. You could maybe look at a Utah win. They beat the Blues early in November. But if you look past that, there's a 5-1 loss to the Jackets, a 7-2 loss to the Stars. They lost to St. Louis as well after having beaten them earlier. And, they have beaten the Islanders, but, for the most part, they have dropped a fair few results against what you might consider teams in playoff positions. And so Boston, look, I think that they're an okay team, but if you look at the lineup, it's not super surprising as to why things maybe are coming a little bit harder. Up front, they've got Geeky, Zacha, and Pastrnak. If Pastrnak is healthy, I think that this team really can't afford to have Pastrnak sidelined for, particularly long. He is one of their most important skaters, and without him, this offense really just craters. They've got Marchand, Lindholm, and Brazeau holding down the second line, and Marchand, whatever he has left in the tank, he is being asked to do double duty because their top six is definitely lacking in goal-scoring punch. I know that we talk about the Jets maybe having some 5v5 issues, but imagine it's extraordinarily magnified for this Bruins team. And while they have been potting in more goals recently, again, it's against pretty bottom feeder teams. Their bottom six is not terrible, but it's also not good. You've got Frederick, Coyle, and Kastelik on the third, and then Koepka, Beecher, and McLaughlin on the fourth. And so, what you're getting a real sense of is that this Bruins team is, again, on life support. If you look at the roster, there's defensive responsibility, but in terms of actual scoring ability and offensive creation, not a lot going on here. The Bruins are really hanging on by a thread. And look, they're not a terrible team, but I think if you're to compare them to a lot of the true playoff contenders out there, they're definitely pretty far down the pack. I'd rank them pretty well below the Jets. And that I've often had tough standards for Winnipeg. Boston falls well below that. The Bruins really don't have a lot going for them. On defense, I mean, it's looking a little bit better. They've got Esterly and McAvoy on the first pairing, Zadorov and Carlo on the second, Lowry and Peak on the third. You probably don't want to see Esterly on your first pairing. McAvoy, of course, is still great, but the rest of this blue line, I mean, it's got guys. Carlo and Zadorov are an okay second pairing, not great. But beyond that, it actually in some ways does remind me of the Jets defense, where you have a few guys probably playing elevated roles that in an ideal world you don't have. And that's also asking a fair bit of Swayman and Korpisalo to try and carry the load. This team has given up a lot of high danger chances. And when you look at how the team is kind of arranged and the lack of elite puck moving talent, both at forward and on defense, not a big shocker. This is one of those scenarios where Hampus Lindholm, having been out for a considerable amount of time, is having a tremendous impact. And you look at the power play units, this is where the Jets honestly should have a pretty sizable advantage. Now, the PK is still going to have to contend with Pasta if he is healthy enough to go. Again, not really much of an updated status beyond day-to-day, so we'll just have to wait till tomorrow to see if he's actually in. If not, this really does need to be a game the Jets win. I know that I say that about some opportunities against weaker teams. I think that this qualifies. The Bruins are certainly not a tough out. They have won 15 games. They're not some pushover team. But if you're the Jets and you want to show that you're serious and that you're trying to maybe turn around your recent run of form, beating up on a team that has only scored 75 goals to date is probably a good way to start getting things back on track. This is home advantage. You've got a couple of games here before you have to hit the road again for a little bit. I think that this is a great opportunity for the Jets to add another couple of points, and they are trying to get a bit of a spark up front. They are bringing in Nikita Chibrikov, and Chibrikov will probably slot in somewhere in the middle six. I think that there's been a fair bit of debate as to where he'll actually play. Now, the most likely scenario is that he plays in Ehlers' spot on the second line, which could be. He's not a natural center, so he's not going to be taking up Nemesnikov's spot. But I just sort of wonder if maybe the Jets try him in the bottom six instead. I think you could see like an Iafallo, Nemesnikov, Perfetti line, and then maybe you put Chibrikov with Kupari and Barron, or maybe with Lowry and Niederreiter and move Appleton to the fourth. I think that there are many ways to arrange this. I don't really know that I have a particular preference. The thing with Chibrikov is that, he is going to have some defensive liability. So we'll chat a little bit more about what to expect from him and where he might make the most sense, especially, not only in this stint, but in a future potential stint towards the end of the season later in the show. But I think for this game, I'm going to set my expectations pretty low. He did have a goal in his first NHL game last year. Going to be a bit of a different scenario, and with Winnipeg kind of struggling to create recently, I don't quite know what he's going to do in his first game back, so we'll see. He's been one of the top scorers for the Moose. Maybe he brings a little bit of feistiness and a bit of energy to a lineup that, quite frankly, hasn't been getting things going all that effectively so far. But, tomorrow or today's a new day. You never know what's going to happen. Maybe, just maybe, the Jets offense is going to start feeling some of the pressure of the recent lack of scoring. And again, they're playing the Bruins. This should be an opportunity for the Jets to come away with some home ice advantage. But we'll chat about what Chibrikov is going to bring and whether it makes sense to send Lambert down in just a few short seconds. But before we go too much further, I want to let you know about our friends and partners at Prize Picks. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, because if you love sports, you're going to love Prize Picks, the best place to turn your sports knowledge into real money. Whether it's hockey, football, or any of your favorite sports, Prize Picks makes it easy to get in on the action. You want to get started today because you can win up to 200 times your money on Prize Picks. You'll get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. No need to win. The $50 is just guaranteed. Prize Picks also offers fun weekly promotions like Taco Tuesday, where select player projections are discounted up to 25%. If you're thinking about something for this week, Kyle Connor is starting to heat up again. I think he's probably a fair shot to get, over 5 shots this week. and probably over 2 goals. I think that that's a fair thought. He's already got one earlier, so surely he's going to beat one out, later this week. But hey, maybe he shocks us all. I think it's a great bet, though. I think it's a pretty safe one. And the only way that you can get on the action is to download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 instantly. Prize Picks. Run your game. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode as we're chatting about the Jets call-ups recently, maybe some demotions, and how it's going to shape this upcoming week of Winnipeg Jets hockey. It's been a little bit of a rocky last few weeks for the Jets. In their last 3 games, they are 2-1, so maybe things are starting to stabilize a little bit. But if you're looking at how they've actually played in some of these games, I don't know that the theme has necessarily changed. I think what happened in the Columbus game is probably a little more of a truer reflection of how the Jets have been recently against teams that have pressured and outpaced them. It's just not been particularly pretty. So Winnipeg really wants to turn things around. They want to, show that they are a serious team and get back on a winning track. And they can do that with some potential reinforcements. Now, the Jets are sending Brad Lambert down. And if you want my full verdict, I did give some thoughts last episode about Lambert. My general feeling about Brad is that he looked pretty decent. I think his game against the Hawks was probably one of the better games that he played with the Jets. But on the whole, I would say, I don't know. Lambert looked like he was still trying to figure out the NHL speed of the game, and he looked fine in shifts. I don't think his impact on Winnipeg's roster at this point was super noticeable. I think that there were some really good promising signs for what he might do later this season. But I think if you're asking him to be a 2C right now, there were flashes, but it wasn't sustained. I think it's one of those scenarios where it's just too much too soon, and it's not really fair to expect him to hit the ground running. He looked better than he did in preseason, I'll say that. I thought that his ability to handle the physical nature of the NHL and some of the speed looked a little bit more up to snuff. And I'm not going to sit here and say that, a couple of months in the A really changed a load for Brad compared to where he was in preseason. But it just seemed like he was a little more up to speed. Maybe, having had a couple of weeks of games, hitting the ice pretty frequently was, enough to sort of get him up to speed and get him a little more accustomed to what it would be like at the NHL level. But he's getting sent down. I don't really hate the move. I don't really disagree with it. I would have liked to have seen both him and Chibrikov at some point in the lineup, not because I think that they're going to drastically change things, but I think after the trade deadline, this team has a really interesting potential to have up to 3 rookies rotating in and out of the lineup. And I'm looking at Lambert, I'm looking at Chibrikov, and I'm also looking at Lucius. Now, Lucius, I want to spend some time on a future episode talking about because he only has started getting back into Manitoba's lineup, but he's scored a couple of goals recently. And I think Lucius, for me, is one of the really big secret weapons in this org, mostly because he just hasn't been healthy enough to actually take advantage. When he was drafted, he was one of our highest ceiling prospects. I still think of him as like Kyle Connor light at this point, but whether he'll ever reach that is a huge concern. I'm kind of holding out hope for the sort of Gabriel Velarde career arc, but we're going to let him get a few more games in before we do a little bit of a deeper dive on what's been going well for him, maybe what there is room for concern for, and if he can actually make the Jets lineup, especially this year. Winnipeg, if you look at their forward group, there is a lot of depth and defensive ability, but in terms of elite offensive potential, you're not seeing a ton of pop from this team. Winnipeg's commitment to the CSV line up front is unfortunately making it very hard to find goals elsewhere. And I'm not trying to say this as a slight against that line, but I think we all know that the CSV unit hasn't really been that great this year. And when, they're at even strength, it makes it a little bit challenging for everyone else because the Lowry lines had to pick up a lot of the slack. The Kupari line has had to eat more defensive zone stuff. And it's not like the Kupari line is finishing a load of chances themselves. The Lowry line had a really hot start. They've kind of cooled. The Nemestikov line has seen a lot of change. And even when Ehlers was healthy, it wasn't like they were lighting the lamp every game. So, there's just a lot that is maybe not optimal with this team, and it's stuff that's fixable. But that's why you call up the kids, right? You want to see what they can do when you've got an injury crisis, and you want to see what you need ahead of the trade deadline. Now, I'm still feeling pretty confident about the need for a Brock Nelson type in your top 9. I just think Brock's kind of caliber of player and stature and stuff is really impressive, and I think a very good fit for what this team, this Jets team wants to do. And Brock in particular skates well. He's sizable and he skates well, and he's a great scorer. That's why for me he's like the ideal rental option. But I think for what Winnipeg is trying to do with some of the kids, I think a Chibrikov fits a really interesting role on like your third line. Lowry and Niederreiter have been great together, but I think Appleton has maybe felt a little bit like the odd man out. Not that he's doing poorly, but I feel like he's a much better fourth liner than he is a third liner. The offensive production has kind of dried up a bit, and I think what we saw with him last year or in previous years, where he does enough to be noticeable on the forecheck, but he's not able to add lots of extra skill on top of that, has been a bit of a pain point for the Jets. Partly because the Lowry line plays a fairly large role for this team, and because of that, you need to find ways to get them more goals. And I think Chibrikov is the kind of player who could potentially slide in alongside Lowry and offer that really feisty forechecking ability while also adding a pretty lethal release. Last year, Chibrikov had like 21 goals, I believe it was, or 22 goals, something of that nature. And for a first-year rookie in North America, that's really impressive. Now, I don't use plus or minus, but he was like a pretty noticeable minus like 20 or something at one point last year. The defensive work with him is actually a pretty consistent issue. Plus or minus, again, not really very helpful. But for Chibrikov's particular case, the defensive work is something that's noticeable. He doesn't really man mark that well. He doesn't make a lot of reads. Where you're really expecting him to be valuable is up front in the offensive zone. That's where his relentless offensive efforts down low below the goal line and that nasty release of his are going to be the most effective. But if you're expecting him to be, a defensively stable two-way forward, his game's not there yet. I think that part is really raw, and I'm curious to know if it gets him benched with the Jets quickly, because if he starts making mistakes, you could see Arniel maybe be a little tougher with him. But again, we'll have to see. I don't want to write him off immediately. I am personally a big fan of Chibrikov. I think that he has really explosive potential. And in terms of our prospects, he's up there for me in terms of offensive potential. So I'm excited. I think it would be great to see what he can do. Lambert had a couple of games for himself to kind of get into the rhythm. Chibrikov will get a few games, maybe 3 or 4. We'll have to see. It's all going to depend on Ehlers' timeline. Nick was supposed to potentially skate later this week. It wasn't going to happen tomorrow or today, so it seems like there may be some delay in how fast he's able to get back. And I think if you're the Jets, I honestly would not be hard up to rush him back. Let him heal up safely and check out what you've got in Chibrikov and Lambert both. Lambert, had a stint, so now you've got Nikita for a couple of games. See what he actually can do at this level, right? If he's a capable contributor who might be worth keeping around even once Ehlers is healthy, that would be really useful intel. You don't have to do it right now because you can send it back down and then think about it more towards the trade deadline when you have some more roster flexibility. But I think for the Jets, an evaluation period is really necessary because the Jets just need some kind of a shakeup. The offense is getting stagnant. The creation is starting to really crater. Winnipeg is ranking pretty far down in the league standings in, expected goals, high danger chances, all that fun stuff. And again, I think part of that is definitely a product of the schedule. The road trip that they've just finished was brutal. And so I don't want to completely lay all of it at Winnipeg's feet. There's some stuff there that's just not within their control. But on the whole, the stuff that they can control, they have made it actively a little challenging for themselves. Now, in that same vein, Logan Stanley and Miller were paired together last game. I wonder if Heinola comes back in. Heinola, just for me, is better with Miller than Stanley is. Logan, no matter what they tried to do, they try to make him work. It just hasn't. And Heinola is going to have his own warts, right? He's, below average defensively at times, but the biggest thing is that he can get the puck out faster, and he makes more consistent passes out from the back, which for the Jets right now is a really critical need. So I'd be taking a long, hard look at that. I know that they're trying to give Stanley some runway to improve and prove himself as a rotational or even starting caliber defender, but at some point you've got to cut your losses. His presence is making it even harder for a defensive unit that just does not have a margin for error. I'd honestly even like to see Coghlan back in. I thought Coghlan looked really good in his one game against Vegas. He was instantly more trustworthy on the right side than DeMello and Pionk are right now. And that's, again, maybe a little bit of an indictment of where the Jets' right side defense depth is, less so a ringing endorsement for Coghlan. But I think at this point, given DeMello looking like he's injured and Pionk struggling away from Sandberg, Coghlan might be able to help lift some of the burden, and maybe you can figure out if he's got some more spark to him that could potentially suggest a bigger role in the future. So lots of food for thought on the defensive side of things. Salamonson, I know we've talked about him before. Unfortunately, it seems like he may have broken his collarbone, so he's going to be sidelined for a while. I thought that he might get a rookie game at the end of the year, maybe two, but it's certainly not going to be anytime soon. The way that he was holding his arm after he went awkwardly into the boards the other night, it was very ugly. Don't look at the footage. It was gross. Just hope that he heals up really quickly and returns. But, I'm talking a lot about the Jets' defensive stuff, and a particular trade went down recently that could play into Winnipeg's defensive plans on the right side. We'll chat about that in just a little bit. But before we go too much further, thought I would let you know about our friends and partners at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. If you're watching, some of the upcoming games this weekend, I'm going to be watching the Ravens, hoping for a bounce-back win after a really crappy loss to the Eagles. But maybe you're a Vikings fan and things have been up and down for you the past couple of weeks. If you're getting a hunch while watching, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you're placing your bets. All you have to do is visit FanDuel.com to get started today. Again, if you win your first $5 bet, you'll get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's all at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Hey friends, welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we are chatting about, a pretty interesting Jets situation with the right side defense not being particularly good. Winnipeg's right side depth is down to, Pionk, DeMello, and Miller. Now, I like Miller. I like DeMello when he's healthy. Pionk has been good this year when he's with Sandberg, but all three of these guys in one capacity or another are struggling big time right now. With Miller, I think it's partly because Stanley is not necessarily the kind of partner that I'd be looking for on your left side. With DeMello, I think he might be hurt. If not, age may be catching up to him. And with Pionk, it's just sort of the normal stuff with Pionk that's been, a consistent issue, right? So if you don't have a lot of trust on the right side, what can you do about it? Well, you could go for a Rasmus Andersson, but that would probably cost you an arm and a leg. Now, I'd still do it. Don't get me wrong. I think that would be a phenomenal upgrade for the Jets defense and really a game changer for this franchise because Anderson's still pretty young, relatively speaking, and it would also cost enough of a haul to where the Jets are probably paying a couple of really big prospects and picks. So that would have really big implications. But if the Jets are trying to be, economically conscious, we all know that they do this quite a bit. There is a name that's going to get some attention, and I don't think it's going to happen. For a lot of reasons, I'm pretty sure that this bridge is very much burnt. But in the weird situation where Jacob Trouba would somehow be willing to come back to the Jets, there is a potential scenario that it happens. Now, the Ducks would basically have to eat like half of his salary because he's got another year after this. They paid like a fourth round and something for Trouba. And like the thing with Jake is that he is technically an upgrade to Winnipeg's right side. You could try him alongside Morrissey. I think at this stage of his career, he's like a marginal second pairing defender. That big right shot of his that he had when he was younger, not really as much of a lethal weapon. Half the time, I feel like we just hear about him getting suspended, edgy elbowing hits and stuff. But in terms of the player, I mean, he would be a stronger, physical, stout, right-sided blue liner who's probably better than Pionk and, maybe would help out DeMello a bit. But I can't really see him being worth like $4 million. And if they do eat like half of the contract, you've got him on the books for next year too, which, I mean, it's doable. I just don't know that I like it. The thing with Trouba at this stage is that he's, probably a number 4 or a number 5. And if the Jets are asking him to anchor, maybe the top pairing or something, if DeMello really looks like he can't turn it around, I just don't know if that's really something that I'm super interested in. When I watched him with some of the recent Rangers games, and I don't want to say that this is necessarily a great reflection of him as a player, because like the Rangers have a lot of issues going on, but I saw him getting turnstiled a lot. I saw the defensive awareness taking a real hit. There were mistakes and things from him that are not exactly what you want to see out of one of your top pairing, top paid defenders. And like, I don't know. For me, I just don't really see a scenario where it makes sense to bring him back. He did have like a 30 and 40 point season over the past couple of years. Last year, he had 22 points. It wasn't terrible. But I just don't think that the version of Trouba that used to be, a Winnipeg stalwart and a standout is what we'd be getting nowadays. We're getting, at this point, a guy who's like maybe a little bit better than Pionk, but I also wouldn't really, read a ton into that. So if there's a really cheap trade, I won't hate it, right? But again, it'd have to be cheap. And if the Ducks bought Trouba in with the intention of, flipping him, they're not going to take some cheap contract or a cheap trade of some sort. I would expect that they're thinking they're going to get real assets. And if that's the price for Trouba, stay far away. I think that there is a scenario where you maybe trade for a right-sided blue liner or something, but if it's Trouba, the answer is no. And I think for a lot of reasons, Trouba himself would probably not be that interested. He's got family considerations with his wife, which, he's always put her first. And that part I massively respect. I think that that's really cool. And you really can't hate a guy who's really committed to that side of things. But I think for the Jets, it makes it a lot harder for them to kind of have that conversation again. And Trouba, let's be real, he did force his way out of Winnipeg, and he got what he wanted. So in that respect, if you're the Jets, you're probably thinking that those bridges are burned. You're not really looking to rebuild them. And I don't think that Trouba would have a tremendous interest in coming back. But if he does, and if the Jets want to consummate that relationship somehow, again, pending a cheap price, I'd be willing to listen. But again, it'd have to be cheap. If it's not, again, that's just not really something I'm interested in. And so, if there's a way to make it happen, I'm sure Chevy will work the phones and at least call about it. I think the Jets are probably looking at other players that are former Rangers or about to be former Rangers rather than Jacob himself. I think that maybe a Hedl is of interest, maybe a Kreider. There's just other guys that the Jets would probably be interested in. And I think Trouba at this point, at this stage of his career, not something you want to sink a lot of assets into. But maybe you all disagree. Let me know what you think in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with coverage of Winnipeg versus Boston. Crossing your fingers, it is for a win. But like I said, that's all the time that we've got tonight. Thanks for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.